Hi, welcome to another edition of This Issue. My guest this time is David Swanson, who's a co-founder of AfterDowningstreet.org and a leader of Progressive Democrats for America. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you here. David is currently in Maine on a book tour. He has a brand new book out called Daybreak, Undoing the Imperial Presidency and Forming a More Perfect Union. First, tell us a bit about yourself, David. Where do you live?
I live in Charlottesville, Virginia. I can see Thomas Jefferson's house out my window, and he's rolling in his grave.
Oh, he is.
He is indeed.
And why is he rolling in his grave?
He feared something called elected despotism. He didn't want to elect a king and then another king and then another king every 4 years. He wanted something very different from that. He worked on a constitution that put the power of our government in a legislature with an executive to execute the will of that Congress. And we've transferred just about all the power from the legislature to the so-called executive. He and most of the people who put that Constitution together would not be very happy.
How did you get started in political work?
I don't know, pretty gradually, not some one traumatic childhood incident, but I was attending graduate school there at the University of Virginia, studying philosophy, and I got involved in a living wage campaign. I thought that the people emptying the trash cans while we're sitting there studying philosophy shouldn't have to work a second and third job when they get home. The university's sitting on $1 billion, building new sports stadiums and so on. Couldn't we pay them enough to live? And from there I got involved in further advocacy and activism around economic issues and justice issues, and then peace and war issues.
Now, I said earlier that you were a founder of AfterDowningstreet.org. What is After Downing Street? Tell us what that's all about.
It means that in May of 2005, some documents came out called the Downing Street Minutes and the Downing Street Memos that were at that point some of the strongest, most authoritative pieces of evidence that, as we all knew at that point, we were lied into an unnecessary war in Iraq. And so we said, well, we need a coalition, we need a campaign, we'll call it After Downing Street. After this has happened, we need to end these wars, we need to hold the people who lied us into a war accountable. And so we've been exposing and promoting further pieces of evidence and angles through which we might get some accountability.
Tell us more about your book, Daybreak. Tell us a bit about what it's all about.
This is taking a step back from activism to think about what's working, what's not working in lobbying our government in Washington. Why is it that in most opinion polls on most issues, the American people is overwhelmingly in one place and our government is doing something different when they're supposed to be representing us? What are the forces of corruption, the money, the media, the parties, the things we know about, and what has happened in terms of where power sits in Washington? Why is that significant, and what can we do about it? How can we be more strategic and more effective in our activism? So most of the book is not how bad things are, but what do we do about it, and what do we envision as a dramatically better government and system of society than what we've got now.
Now, I know you were very critical of President Bush. You helped lead the impeachment campaign nationally against him. But at the same time today, you're one of the most, I would say, fervent critics of Obama, as he is really continuing many of the same policies that Bush was. Can you describe a little bit about how you see these similarities between the two?
Well, I think that's a fair characterization if you ignore the people threatening to kill him, calling him a grandmother murderer and a foreigner and a Muslim and a socialist and an evildoer and so forth. Aside from that brand of criticism of Obama, in terms of criticism of his policies and what I honestly believe they actually are, I certainly have been a critic. We had President Bush establish new powers, powers, for example, to write laws, with signing statements, sign a bill into law, write a statement, which parts you're going to change. And Barack Obama, as a candidate, was a serious critic of that. Now he engages in it. And so we could go through dozens of abuses of power, and I do in the book. And in each case, some of them are being abused more, some are being abused less, but they're all being cemented in place in a way that one administration alone couldn't do.
In the book, again, part of the title is Forming a More Perfect Union. What is that part of the book about?
Well, we have a constitution that's barely been tweaked in 2 centuries and a quarter. We are dragging behind international treaties and other nations' constitutions and bills of rights. We have a system where the laws we do have, we're not enforcing. There are those who are too high and too important to be under the rule of law. We have a former president and a former vice president confessing to torture on television, and nothing happens. So how are we going to get our laws enforced? How are we going to repeal the bad ones, pass the good ones, amend the Constitution? What's our vision for down the road? If this country survives for a while, what do we want it to be? And how can we get it there?
One of the things you are talking about is that the Congress has really abdicated its powers to this imperial presidency. Can you discuss that in a bit more?
Well, Congress is happy to have the presidents make the laws and the presidents decide on the wars and the presidents make the treaties and so on without congressional decision making. They want to be consultants. They're happy to talk, but they don't want power. And if they're going to have any power and use it on our behalf, we've got to take them and shake them a little bit, but they also have to take those powers away from the president. And the only way they do that is through checking his abuses, and that means impeachments and that means subpoenas. We had dozens of subpoenas in the last Congress that are just left hanging, not enforced. They're not reissuing them. Now they won't. Now they're afraid to even subpoena anyone. And we impeached a judge this year for groping people. We won't impeach a judge who signed memos legalizing torture and legalizing aggressive war because apparently Fox News wouldn't like it, and that's a big factor for the House Judiciary Committee. But if you're not going to impeach anyone, at least, unless they're a Democrat and sex is involved, you're not going to impeach anyone in the executive branch or formerly thereof, or whom some television network might not want you to impeach them, then you have no power. And if you won't subpoena anyone from the executive branch and enforce your own subpoenas, why should anyone listen to you? They're happy to have you talk, but they're not going to listen to it.
What does the Constitution say about the powers of the president, the executive, and Congress?
The first 60% almost of the Constitution is devoted to the first branch of our government, the Congress, and gives that Congress just about every power they could dream up, and the power to make every law, the power to raise and spend every dime, the power to decide when and where we have wars, to ratify or reject treaties and appointments, and so on. The president, in a short little Article 2, is commander-in-chief of the military in a war, in a time and place decided on and funded by the Congress, and he is to faithfully execute the laws as passed by Congress. He can sign a law or he can veto a law. He can't rewrite a law. He can't make his own laws with executive orders. He can't make laws with secret memos. He doesn't have the power to imprison people with no process. He can't spy on you without a warrant, and so on. A very, very different image from what you have today.
Now, as I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, please, when the Democrats retook the Congress and the Senate, they promised big changes. And when they retook the presidency with Obama, they promised big changes, that they were going to roll back some of these egregious things that the Bush and the Republicans had done. Well, how would you grade the Democrats in the Congress and in the presidency so far in this context of rolling back these dramatic changes?
Somewhere below zero. Certainly, failing doesn't cover it. But I think it's a lot more relevant to have that discussion about Congress, because it's just not predictable. It's just not expectable that a president would voluntarily give back powers. You know, Barack Obama has been given vastly more powers than perhaps anybody on earth, but to expect him to give them back is a little bit dreamy, you know. But to insist that Congress take them back, and to insist that Congress do the things we elect it to do, we have an absolute moral responsibility to force that to happen. And it's the most likely thing, uphill fight as it may be, by which we take control of our country. We elected the Democrats to majorities in 2006 to end wars. That was the big issue. Everyone agreed to end the war in Iraq. Immediately in 2007, we have a debate on whether to escalate it. Same thing in 2008, and now we have a debate on whether to escalate a war in Afghanistan. We worked hand in glove with John Conyers' office in 2005 when he was the ranking minority member on the Judiciary Committee, wanted to end the wars, wanted to impeach Bush and Cheney and so forth. Come 2006 election, 2007, we're sitting in his office and being arrested, taken to jail, and he's telling us Fox News wouldn't like it.
Is that the ultimate answer, the reason why the Democrats aren't moving on all these things that they promised they would, that they were elected by the voters to do, is because of Fox News, or does it go deeper than that?
Well, everybody in Congress has accepted that all the power is in the White House. The big competition is which party gets to be the emperor and which party gets to have the next shot in the White House. And so the Democrats are happy. They're thrilled. They've got the throne. And their leader is the man who was supposed to execute the will of the Congress. They don't have loyalty to a branch of government. They have loyalty to a party. We've gone from the 3 branches to the 2 parties. And the Republicans, you know, their loyalty is to the top Republican in Congress, but they don't want Bush and Cheney and gang held accountable for their abuses or crimes. They want the president to have absolute power in the future. Most presidents in modern America are Republicans. So just strategically, from partisan thinking, the Democrats would be smarter to be putting power in Congress, where they tend to be the majority. And the Republicans, it's understandable that they want all the power in the White House. But Democrats don't think very well, and they don't play offense. And everybody's just sort of accepted. And we have this short time frame we think in, and they're happy right now.
Now, let me ask you this question. Is getting health care, real health care reform, part of this vision that you talk about in your book, of forming a more perfect union? Is health care a part of that vision? It
is. I think we need not just negative rights, you know, the government can't abuse you in this way, the government can't abuse you in that way, but positive rights, a right to health care, a right to a basic standard of living, minimal survival in a very wealthy country, a right to housing, a right to a good education, which ought to include, if you want it, free preschool through graduate school. It's completely affordable if we weren't spending all our money on wars we actually oppose.
And bailouts for the Wall Street.
Yeah, now you have something bigger than the war and military money. Now you have bailouts for Wall Street. And again, Congress isn't even permitted to know what's happening there, much less control it. But Congress was happy to vote for it, with over 90% of the phone calls into Congress opposing it. This is from across the political spectrum. Opposing the Wall Street bailouts when they were done when Bush was president and continued when Obama was president.
Why did they do it? Why did they basically reject 90% of the American people's opinion on that issue?
Many of their campaigns are paid for by Wall Street.
You're talking Republicans and Democrats, right?
Yes, and top recipient in history being Barack Obama, and top...
In the last election.
Yes, and top donors to Barack Obama being Wall Street. So there is that big influence. But, you know, everyone in power in Washington is in that group. These people who run Wall Street rotate in and out of public service, as they call it, in Washington. And it's Wall Street bankers, if you can call them bankers, running the program to bail out Wall Street.
Let's talk about Afghanistan and Iraq and Pakistan. Are we ever getting out of these wars? Again, we were promised by the Democrats when they came into power in 2006 when they took back the Congress, largely because of the tremendous opposition to the Iraq War. Today we hear in the polls that over 60% of the American people want us out of Afghanistan, but it appears that nothing is happening.
Well, President Obama has broken a slew of promises, but escalating in Afghanistan isn't one of them. He campaigned on escalating in Afghanistan, and members of his party in Congress take orders from him, regardless of what they think or what they campaigned on or what they promised. So you have to reverse a promise in this case. But the majority of Americans before the last election approved of being in Afghanistan. The majority of Americans now disapprove of being in Afghanistan.
Why do you think the change?
Well, I think there's been escalation there. There's been a small number, relatively speaking, of American deaths, but there's been deaths there. There's been a fraudulent election, and now the appointment of an unelected leader in Afghanistan. There's been resistance within the U.S. military. There's been resistance by allies in Afghanistan. It's more in the news. Barack Obama was going around giving speeches, I'll end the war, I'll end the war, I'll end the war. And when you got to the details, it wasn't quite that on Iraq. But the fact that he was going to enlarge the military and escalate in Afghanistan was much less well known, where now Afghanistan is the focus of all the media attention, and everyone assumes that everything has just been settled in Iraq, which is a very dangerous assumption. But I think that where the media attention is explains what the public is thinking about.
Now you, in order to promote your book called Daybreak, you've been on a tour of the country. It's going to be a 50-city tour. Right now you're about halfway through that tour.
Yep.
What's your sense of the peace movement today? How are they doing across the country? What's your feeling about where the peace movement should be going in terms of these issues of Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, we've had huge successes that we have to remind each other. We've persuaded the American public to be against wars, to distrust war propaganda, to shoot down the lies that we need to go into Iran, which has been successful for years now, largely because they were so similar to the lies that were exposed about Iraq. We've prevented a lot from getting worse. We've discouraged recruitment and so forth, and we have to keep up that educational fight. This is going to be a long campaign, but we largely defunded and demobilized the peace movement in November because there was an election where we elected people who, for some reason, we imagined there might be a slightly better chance of them doing what we wanted, which is exactly when you ought to invest more in a movement.
What do you mean by defunded the peace movement? Can you explain what you mean by that?
Peace organizations ceased to exist. Major peace coalitions saw their donors and their funding drop off by 3/4. That people were not interested in funding a movement that wasn't needed anymore because we had elected Democrats. Right? This is like the labor movement that won't do anything for their bill, the Employee Free Choice Act, to get the right to legally unionize because they've elected Democrats, and that's all you need to do, even though obviously it's not everything you need to do. And so we've spent these months sitting on our hands. I haven't, you haven't, but the peace movement as a whole has spent a lot of time saying, well, even, strategically, I'd like to protest these wars because they're still the same wars, but you can't protest a popular president. As if a war is identical with a president, even though it is the Congress that funds and decides on wars. And if you could make that clear to people, you would see turnout increase at anti-war rallies among people who don't want to protest their friend, the president. I think that would be a strategic move for the peace movement.
Your position, I've heard you speak in Bangor last night, and your position is that Congress is where the action is, that the American people need to be communicating with Congress about how they feel about these issues, and that's where the real pressure point is. Is that basically accurate?
Well, there's counter-recruitment work to do, there's media work to do, as you're doing right here, this moment, but in terms of influencing what's decided in Washington, whether a president does something good or bad is good or bad luck, but we don't have any control over it. We just don't. And largely, we don't have any control over senators, And in Maine, the rest of the country is obsessed with Maine's senators. Maybe Maine could give them a break and focus on where we actually have a chance at influencing people, and that's with members of the House. In June, the 2 Congress members from Maine were heroes. I think Maine may be the only state where the full congressional delegation in the House voted no on funding these wars. You got lots of Congress members who go home and say, I oppose these wars, but they always vote to fund them. Well, Maine's 2 Congress members voted no. If you think that was a good thing, anytime you think your Congress member's done a good thing, you should thank them, you should reward them, you should praise them, and you should ask for more. Because I have friends who are ruining their family lives, spending their retirement savings, going on starvation fasts to accomplish things like ending these wars. And just because you're a member of Congress doesn't mean that your activism should be limited to voting the right way. Why not publicly commit that you're going to vote no on the next one? Today we heard it's probably going to be $50 billion in another supplemental spending bill, these things we weren't going to have anymore, probably within the next few months. Why not publicly commit now? I'm going to vote no on that next $50 billion, and I want my colleagues to vote with me and start building a list of Congress members who will vote no. Then Maine saves the country, Maine saves the world.
That $50 billion would go a long way solving, I know in our state of Maine, our problems with the defunding of public education, with health care, with fixing our collapsing roads and bridges, and many other things in the state.
Yes.
It's really tragic, all the money that is being wasted, over $10 billion a month on Iraq and Afghanistan today.
Yeah. And just from Maine, you're in the billions, just in tax dollars. You look at costofwar.com and look at that money, and you have to multiply it by 3, 4, 5 times to be realistic at all, because you have debt, interest, you have veterans care, and so forth. And you take that money and you look at how many people you could provide the entire state of Maine with health care, rather than funding these wars that the citizens of Maine oppose. Yeah. There's an obvious trade-off.
And the people do get that. The people do understand that connection. But I think they just have this sense of powerlessness that there's nothing they can do about it.
Well, they shouldn't. They accomplish good things all the time.
Supposedly we live in a democracy too, right?
Supposedly, we never quite have, and we don't even quite have a deep democratic understanding in our own minds of how things should work. When the president said, I'm going to ignore public opinion polls and escalate in Afghanistan or not based on what's best for the country, people applauded and said, thank you for being principled and ignoring us. And we need a deeper understanding of democracy, but we also need to know when we are in the majority, because a lot of times we're in the majority on something in polls, and we think we're in the minority because our televisions and our newspapers are playing up the views of the 20% rather than the 80% of us. So we have to know we're in the majority and then demand that we be listened to.
As we tape this show, just yesterday we learned about Fort Hood, Texas, a Army major, psychiatrist, I understand, killed 13 people and wounded maybe 30 or so. Can you talk about that and generally your feelings about that and as sort of the real collateral damage, if you will, or another form of the collateral damage of these wars?
Well, the president is outraged at the violence, and yet this is not unique violence. We are imposing violence around the world. We are the greatest purveyors of violence. It just doesn't always impact Americans in America.
Those are the words of Martin Luther King, correct?
Indeed, indeed.
Yeah. Talking about Vietnam.
In a very similar time to Afghanistan in Vietnam. And I've been down there to do a fundraiser for the Under the Hood Cafe. Go to Under the Hood Cafe, their website. This is a cafe right next to Fort Hood that has saved veterans' lives. People have come in there suicidal, and they've been told, you have a choice. You don't have to follow illegal orders. In fact, you have an obligation not to. We can help you.
This is a cafe run by the peace movement outside the base?
Run by veterans outside the base, similar to cafes that were around military bases when the Vietnam War was going on. In fact, a reincarnation of one from that generation. And you know, these soldiers are very, very troubled. And I don't know the details, but if this man was a psychiatrist who was counseling soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, as he was, and those soldiers' troubles made him so troubled that he went and killed people in resistance to himself being sent to Afghanistan. You know, it's incredibly disturbing. I mean, he should have understood, we should have reached him, we should have made clear to him that he had nonviolent options, that he didn't have to kill his brothers and sisters on the base, that he could have been more effective in resisting a war. Instead, he's given our cable news shows an excuse to denounce Muslims because his name sounds Muslim. It's not clear to me whether he was Muslim or not. His forms said no religious preference, but apparently when something like this happens and his name sounds Muslim, the explanation is that Muslims kill people. Whereas obviously, you know, in shopping malls and restaurants across the country, wherever Muslims work, they're shooting everybody up, right? No, it's in a military base. But that's not even relevant to the story that we're given on most of our television shows, unlike this one.
On the way to the studio today, I'm listening to right-wing radio talk about this situation, and basically they're saying that Al-Qaeda has infiltrated the U.S. military, right, and that this was a Al-Qaeda-like operation. Right. What do you think of that?
I think it's nonsense. I think it's baseless. I think they can't possibly know anything about this man's motivations and the probability that this man who's never served abroad, who was born in Virginia, where I grew up, that he's a member of Al-Qaeda is just quite a fantastical stretch for obvious political purposes.
Just yesterday I was reading an article about U.S. Army troops stationed in South Korea. The article said that the troops there, who've been to Iraq and Afghanistan many times, they volunteered to go to Korea because their families would be able to come and be with them there. And they are now going to be sent back to Iraq or Afghanistan from Korea, and they're very upset. They're livid, right, saying, you know, we saw this as an opportunity to take a break, bring our families here, spend 2 or 3 years together, and now we're going back to Iraq and Afghanistan. It appears that there's a revolt brewing within the military because these guys are just literally worn out, both physically and emotionally, with these 2 wars going on.
Indeed, and the comments you see from these veterans and from these new recruits, including from Fort Hood, are that we don't know what the purpose is. We don't know why we're being put in Afghanistan or Iraq. And these counselors understand that if these troops don't know what the purpose is, they're not going to be happy and they're not going to stay sane in this process of risking their lives and killing other people, which is incredibly traumatic, no matter whether you're a member of the military or not. They ought to understand that they have the right and they have the obligation to say no to an illegal order. And there are those who have done so, including from Fort Hood. And some have had no penalty, and some have spent months behind bars, and some are spending months behind bars, maybe years behind bars. But they have a moral responsibility to do that, and it's going to be far more effective and useful for everyone than shooting people up.
Well, David Swanson, thank you very much for coming on the show. David is the author of a new book called Daybreak: Undoing the Imperial Presidency and Forming a More Perfect Union. You can find him, one of the best websites in the country. I go there about 5 or 10 times a day. It's called afterdowningstreet.org. And again, thanks, David, for coming on the show. And thank you for watching another edition of This Issue. Until next time, good luck to you all, and please get